Do you drive an old Jeep with a 3 or 4-speed transmission? Are you tired of constantly having to downshift and upshift every time you climb a hill? Does your engine rev so high it sounds like it's gonna blow up going down the highway? Does your Jeep get terrible gas mileage?
Well, for just 15 to 20 minutes of your time, I'll show you how to fix all those problems by installing a Saturn Overdrive on the back of your Dana 18 transfer case. So let's take a look at the overdrive setup before we get it installed. Now this is a Saturn Overdrive kit from Advanced Adapters, and so what it comes with is the planetary gear set. So this will replace the input gear of the transfer case, and in here is where that overdrive actually comes from with those planetary gears. Have a specialized washer, snap ring, so a new gasket. We have the overdrive housing itself with the linkage and the shift forks that'll engage the overdrive, and then the shift lever and linkage. And so this is what will actually be inside the Jeep and what will control turning this overdrive on and off. So getting this installed seems straightforward, but sometimes things that seem straightforward really don't end up being that way. So let's jump to the transfer case, get that inspection cover off, get that old input gear off, and then install this one. Alright, so now that we have the input gear of the transfer case off, we can take a look at that and then compare it to what we're going to replace it with. So obviously this gear, it's pretty simple. Obviously the splines for the output of the transmission, and then the gears to drive the transfer case. So with it being all one piece, whatever the output of the transmission is, that's obviously the direct input of the transfer case. Now with the overdrive unit that we're replacing it with, same thing, splined on the inside, the gear on the outside. But now, however, the splines and the gear are not solidly connected. So there's obviously, we can rotate the splines independent of the gear right now, and that's because of this planetary set inside this unit. And that's what drives, that's how we get the overdrive for this unit. The input of the transmission will come into here, spin those planetary gears, and then as a result, this transfer case gear, input gear, will spin faster than the output of the transmission. So the gear we just took out was obviously held in place by this nut to the output shaft of the transmission. Now this new unit will also thread to the output shaft of the transmission. And it may be hard to see in there. So at the end of the splines, there's a collar that's threaded. So when we mount this to the output shaft of the transmission, we're going to take a 1/2-inch drive extension, put it into that little star there, and actually tighten it on to that transmission output shaft. And then that's where this washer and snap ring come into play. So these will lock this unit in place so that it won't slide off of the output shaft of the transmission. All right, so let's get this over to the transfer case and start getting that threaded in. Alright, so we have the unit in place. When I was starting to torque it down, it needs to be torqued somewhere between 100 and 120 foot-pounds. So when I torqued it to 100 foot-pounds, it started to spin the motor over. So I was able to get a large enough socket, put it on the crankshaft on the front, and wedge it under the frame to keep the motor in place and then be able to torque this down. So now that this is torqued in place, it's not fully ready to go yet. So this washer or spacer has grooves on a little star pattern that fits into that square drive, and then there's one tab that needs to align in this collar. So I need to tighten it down a little bit more in order for that drive to be aligned so that this extra little bump on this washer can sit into one of the notches in this collar. Alright, so we have the washer and snap ring all in place. I hope I was able to capture it well on the camera. It was tough trying to have the camera, the light, also try and work in there and see in there all at the same time. So hopefully we got some good shots. So the next thing we're going to do is install this housing. But before we do that, there's two things we need to do. One is install this oil catcher or oil tube. So obviously there's bearings in the backside of this housing, and there's no way for oil to get to those bearings. So what this little tube trough does, it'll sit right in this little spot. So what this little trough is going to do, as oil is spinning around inside the transfer case off of the other gears, it's going to get trapped in this little trough and run back and feed those bearings back here. So it's very important that we have this in, make sure that it's fully seated. The next thing we need to do is measure from the transfer case to where that hub assembly is to make sure that it's at the right point. In the instructions here it says 0.677 inches away from that face of the transfer case. So we'll get this tapped in, go measure that, and then get this mounted to the transfer case. Alright, so we got the overdrive unit all torqued in place. I put thread sealant on all of those bolts to make sure no oil leaks out from the transfer case. Alright, so the last thing to do is install the shift linkage. And to do this, we'll take a couple bolts out of the top cover of the transmission where this bracket will mount. So then it'll tie back to the shift rail on the overdrive unit, and then just a couple spots for adjustment. So I'll get it in place. I won't fully adjust it until the tub is on because I don't know how far forward this can go before it hits the dash or anything like that. But we'll get it in and take a rough guess at it. Alright, so now we have everything installed, and before I wrap this video up, I want to go through and talk about how this overdrive unit is different than if we just had a transmission with an overdrive gear in it. So let's jump over to the table and take a look at some numbers. Alright, so here we have a side-by-side comparison of the gear ratios in an AX5, which is what I have in my Jeep TJ, and the T90, which is in this 3B. So the AX5 is a 5-speed, and so it has that overdrive. Fifth gear is the overdrive of 0.85. And then here is the T90, obviously just a 3-speed and no overdrive, so that final drive is just a 1-to-1. So the Saturn Overdrive is a 25% reduction. So what that means is that overdrive would be 0.75 here. But now because that overdrive is separate from the transmission, it means we can engage it regardless of the gear that we're in the transmission. So actually this is not what the shift pattern will be, but if we take a slide over, this is actually what the shift pattern could be for this Jeep. So we still have first, second, third, which is the same as we had over here on the left, but we're able to engage that overdrive in first gear, we're able to engage that overdrive in second gear, and then finally third gear. So the ability to engage the overdrive in first and second is obviously a big advantage, because now we can essentially split the gears. So and go from just a 3-speed or what would have been a 4-speed with this overdrive to now have a 6-speed. And so the ability to split the gears is where it comes into play with having to upshift or downshift going up hills. Where we're always, second gear we're really revving out and we try to shift to third and it's not enough and the motor starts to bog. Well, now we can run in the second overdrive and really climb that hill easily and keep the engine RPMs right where we want to be. And so with engaging overdrive in third gear, that's where we're going to be able to lower those RPMs at the higher speeds or highway speeds going down the road. So as we just talked about, we can engage this overdrive in any gear in the transmission, but the fact that it's also upstream of the transfer case means that we can engage it in any gear in the transfer case. So we can engage it in, obviously, two-wheel drive high or four-wheel drive high, and even four-wheel drive low. All right, so I hope all that made sense and that I didn't ramble too much looking at those numbers. Once the Jeep is all done, we can do a video where we go through and drive it and actually engage and disengage the overdrive in each gear and how it works in terms of actually driving the Jeep. But that's pretty much going to do it for this video. It was a fairly straightforward install, not really any specialty tools needed, and it's another big item checked off the list for this Jeep. So I'm still waiting on some parts for the steering system, but there's obviously still plenty to do on this Jeep while we wait for those. So depending upon when I get those parts, the next video may be finishing up the steering or maybe working on some other system on this Jeep. But thank you for taking the time and watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.